So, hello Team Qualitative 2019-2020. I just want to give you a short overview of what this project is about, the different tools that you have in your toolbox to do your thesis project. Because I'm going to assume that none of you will actually have done qualitative research in any depth before, so it helps to know a little bit more about it. So, why would you even do qualitative research? Clearly, I love it. I love it more than SPSS. I love it more than statistics, and that is saying something. But why would you do it? Well, obviously, in all types of research, we want to find out things about our world. And what you've been used to so far is using a theory to guide how you should investigate your world. Usually it involves testing a hypothesis and then finding support for it or not. But there are other questions where a theory doesn't necessarily exist, or where having a hypothesis is not appropriate. Sometimes what we want to do is to not start from the top down with a theory, but we want to start from the bottom up with data themselves. And sometimes what we're interested in is not numbers, but people's experience. How does stuff work? How do people experience certain events? So just looking at what you are interested in, well, this is what I'm interested in, by the way. What's it like when you're an athlete and you get injured? I'm interested in that because it happened to me 2 years ago. What's that like? How does that influence your sense of self? How do you go about your daily stuff? What is it like when you're gay and you're coming out? What's that process like for different people? My thesis student this year has looked at this question. What's it like interacting with other people when you've got facial paralysis? Other people start behaving differently towards you. How does that make you feel about yourself? What do people experience when they go surfing, or hill running, or going on a job interview? What do people experience when they do a certain thing? How do people construct their gender identity? People who identify as gender neutral, for example, how do they know that? How do they arrive at that conclusion? How does that work? What goes on when students revise for exams? What really goes on when students revise for exams? What are the processes? Qualitative psychology can give you an answer to that. Why do people have tattoos? In places where nobody would see them. Where they themselves wouldn't even see them because it's on their back. Why? So these kind of questions you can't answer by testing a theory, because that limits the kinds of answers that you're going to get. When people do mind wandering, and a lot of us do that, what do we actually do? Why do we do it? What happens when we do that? Again, a question that you can't answer by looking at a theory. There might be theories about mind wandering, but if you're interested in what do people do, then you can't put a number on that. You've got to look at what people's actual experiences with that are. So before you start out do your study, you've got to think about certain concepts. This is a bit of philosophy of science, which is really interesting. And you've got to think about your ontology, first of all. So ontology is about your view of the world. The question is, what is there to know? What is possible to know? Now you can, this is all a continuum, it's not so black and white, but if you're on one end of the spectrum, if you're a realist, then you assume that what you see is what you get. There is a real world out there that you can discover. On the other hand, if you are a relativist, then there's no such thing as an objective reality. Everything is bound by context and interpretation. Now, your ontology influences your epistemology. Epistemology is about how can we find out. The epistemology that you've been used to up till now is positivism. Positivism is where you investigate the world by looking at what you can see. Things you can't see, or things that don't have a sort of behavioral marker, we don't investigate. So you can think back to early studies where things like Freud's ideas, you wouldn't be able to really see. You'd have to make some assumptions as to what was there in people's subconscious. So it's not surprising that some people said, you can't investigate that because you can't actually see what's going on. And in all of our experiments that we do within quantitative research, we get some kind of measure of latent variables. So you get a memory score, which is what you can see on the outside about what people's memories were like. You look at people's behavior, you look at outputs of their mind. So all you investigate is what is there. So you can find out about reality by looking at what is there. Then you've got constructivism on the other end of the epistemology continuum. And constructivism says that in order to find out about these different context-bound realities, you've got to look at what people themselves do when they construct the world. How do people themselves interpret their world? So we shouldn't look at what is there, but we should look at how do people create what is there? How do people talk about their language? How do they interpret their world? So the next stage then is methodology, which is more specifically how do you find out. Now, if you are a realist following a positivist paradigm, then you're more likely to be a quantitative researcher. So you observe things you can see using numbers and quantifiable measures in order to say something about the reality of the world. However, if you are a relativist who believes that in order to find out about these context-bound realities, you need to adopt a qualitative approach. You need to not look at numbers, but look at words. Look at what are people saying, and what are the discourses that people are using. What are the narratives people construct? And from that you can also tell that the kind of participants and the focus on what you want from those participants is going to be different depending on where you are on those continua. So continui. I'm getting my Latin mixed up. Anyway, I think continuums is a nice sort of English version of Latin. Who should we study? If you are a realist using a quantitative approach, then what you want is generalizing. You've been told that over the years. You want to have a representative sample. You want to make sure that you can that your participants don't have any outliers. They're all going to respond in the same way, so you can say something about the population at large. So it's called a nomothetic approach. You want to look at generalizations, general laws. Whereas if you are a qualitative researcher interested in context-bound realities, then you're taking an ideographic approach. You're interested in how does this particular individual see the world. You're looking at what it is like for this individual or this small group. You're looking at what's different between people rather than, well, not necessarily what's different, but so what is specific about their experience rather than trying to generalize to a population. So that's one of the key things to get your head around. The purpose of your study and your thesis is not to generalize. It's almost like doing an anthropological research. You're studying one tribe. You want to get to know that tribe in depth. So bear that example in mind. Now there are lots of different ways you can collect data and do analysis in qualitative research. You may previously thought there's only one, but there are lots of different things. So we've got IPA, interpretative phenomenological analysis, grounded theory, narrative research, conversation, discourse analysis, cooperative inquiry, focus groups, and thematic analysis. And that's not an exhaustive list. My prediction is that you will probably do thematic analysis, grounded theory, and IPA mostly. And maybe narrative research for the gender identity project. I can imagine that would work well with narrative research as well. But that's up to you. So what I'm going to do now is to just talk about each of these things briefly so you get some idea of what they are. Then I'd like you to go away and read the chapters in the Smith book to familiarize yourself with that further, and then maybe find one method or methodology that you think is best suited to your particular question. So IPA, interpretative phenomenological analysis. One of my thesis students this year is investigating what it's like to be a religious scientist at the University of Aberdeen. It's about their personal experience. How do they merge those two seemingly contradictory concepts of aspects of the self? So it's about personal experience. It's not aimed at generalization. There's a double hermeneutic, which means that you've got a participant, an interviewee, who is trying to interpret what's happened to them. They're trying to interpret their world, making sense of it. And then you've got yourself, the interviewer, who is trying to make sense of the participant, trying to make sense of themselves. So as a researcher, you are involved in generating the data. You're not objectively removed from the process. That's what would be the case in a quantitative project. You want to sort of avoid researcher influence, but here you're very much part of it. Your sample will be very small. In the case of religious scientists at the University of Aberdeen, there were only 4 of them, so we interviewed all of them. And it's a homogeneous sample, so that means they've all sort of experienced the same thing, or they've all gone through the same phenomenon can be applied to all of them. And you usually interview them one-to-one, semi-structured. So you have some questions written, but depending on where the interview is going, you can be open to ask different kinds of questions. So the way you analyze it would be to do a thematic analysis of each interview, and then you generate themes for each, and then as you start writing up, you compare, in this case, all 3 interviews, and you look for an even higher level of abstraction. So you look for generating a master theme, as it were, or several master themes. When you write up, you give a narrative account of all the themes. You describe what these themes are about and how they are expressed by the various participants, and then also you start making links to the literature. grounded theory, that's quite an involved and complex procedure, but it's very, very interesting. As the name suggests, grounded theory is about building theories. So you're not using a theory to test something, but you use the data to generate a theory. It's inductive, from the bottom up. It's positivist in the sense that when you generate your theory, you try to say something about an external reality, and it's done in a really systematic way. But it's constructivist in the sense that this reality that you're trying to make a theory about, the reality actually consists of people's views, people's own experiences. And another feature of this is that it happens in stages. So you might start very broad, just sort of eating away at some aspects of the topic. You ask some open questions, you get a few participants, and you just ask them some broad questions about something. And then, based on that, you further refine your questions. You start focusing in on one particular aspect. So you might start with, this general idea of how does chronic illness actually affect people's lives. But as you go on, the final version of when you've interviewed all your people, what these interviews are about are actually how do people change their life and themselves to accommodate physical losses and to reunify body and self. So that's a much more nuanced question that you wouldn't be able to ask beforehand, but only afterwards that question would become apparent. So the coding is quite iterative, which means once you've done some coding, you go back to your data and see does it actually fit with the other data, and you go back and forwards a few times. And you need to ask analytical questions about the categories that you generate. So I'll come back to that later on. I'll keep that in my head for now. When you do narrative research, you basically want to know, you want to find out about what people are like through the stories that they tell about themselves. People love telling stories about themselves. It's, as a society, we're good at telling stories. We always used to tell stories before we had the ability to write things down. It's through stories that we often make sense of ourselves. So one really good question, general type of question to answer with this approach is questions about identity. How does identity develop? How do people develop their gender identity? How do people develop their teaching identity, their athlete identity, etc.? So you would usually do a life story interview, maybe not, in some cases, not the whole life, but a section of their lives. So people love this, participants love this. You just ask them, tell me about your life. This whole hour is all about you. People love that. You get very willing participants. And then when you analyze it, you look at what's the narrative like. So you try and make the interview as open as possible, so people just keep talking about their story. And you look at, okay, the way people talk about themselves, is that a tragedy? Is it comedy? Is it regressive? Does it get worse all the time? Is it progressive? Does it get better? Or is it stable? What are the main issues that you can identify in the story? What are the metaphors that people use? That's quite informative about who they think they are. What are the values and beliefs that are coming through? You can use this type of research as action research. What I mean by that is that in some cases, like research about breast cancer, different people who've experienced that might have interpreted that event in different ways, and the people who sort of tell themselves a negative story about it they might actually be helped by listening to other people who tell a positive story about it. So how they coped, and you know, whether it's had any positive effects on their lives. So that's what I mean by action research. Conversation analysis, I don't think that's something that you will use, because it's well, it's not really relevant to the topics, and it's quite difficult to set up and get familiar with it. But I'll explain it anyway. So it's about how people talk, what they do when they talk on a turn-by-turn level. So I say something and the other person responds, and then the other person responds, etc. And when an alien, if an alien was to land on this planet and was to listen to our conversations, they wouldn't understand how on earth we're able to actually understand one another. Because just look out for it. You try this next time you're talking with someone. So many assumptions that there are about reality that are implicit in how we talk. And conversation analysis sort of tries to make these explicit and write about them. One of the premises is here that when we talk, we don't communicate, but we do things. Talking is action. When I say to somebody, nice day, I'm not telling them that it's a nice day. I mean, everyone can see that it's a nice day. What I'm doing is I acknowledge their existence. I say, I like you. I want to say hi to you. Or I say, I feel a social pressure to say hello because you're all walking on the same corridor and I know you. I'm not actually wishing them a nice day. It's not communication, it's a kind of action. And there are lots of examples. So have a look in the textbook for other examples. When you do research, you need to do that on naturally occurring data, and that's why this is so difficult, because it's really hard to get data. And you can do that either as an unmotivated inquiry, so you can just overhear conversations, listening out for interesting things to pop up, or you can try and look out for a certain thing that you're interested in. When you do the analysis, you try to collect instances of a particular phenomenon, like this idea of I overheard two students once. They were walking down the Spittal and they were walking behind me, and the first one said, "Hey, how you doing?" And the other one said, "Oh, fine." And then in the next sentence he said, "Oh, I'm feeling awful." And I thought, hold on. My alien brain would go, that doesn't make sense. You just said you were fine, but you're feeling awful. It's like that first encounter when people say, "How are you doing?" "I'm fine, I'm fine." It's not a real question. It's not really about how are you. It's something else. So people do something when they're talking, and it's not really a communication in that instance. So give that some thought. It's quite interesting. You can also use this as action research to improve, perhaps communications at job center interviews, or calls to Nightline or suicide prevention lines. Then you've got discourse analysis, which it's similar to conversation analysis, but it's a bit broader. So rather than looking at what people say on a turn-by-turn basis, it looks at what do people say in general. Listening to somebody talking for 5 minutes, what are they actually doing in that talk? In the textbook, there's a really good example of a participant who was being interviewed about breaking up with her boyfriend, and actually at the end of the passage, it was about a whole page, actually it read like an apology. She was trying to apologize for breaking up, and really telling the researcher that she'd done everything to try and save it, even though she didn't actually use the word sorry or apology. So the way you analyze it is through thinking about, how does this text come across to me? Does it read like an apology? Does it read like a justification? Does it read like an acknowledgement? And it's really important to take the context into account there, because people tell you different things in a different way compared to how they would talk to a family member or the doctor or a lawyer, for example. When you read up about discourse analysis, there are two ways. So there's one, the one I just described. There's also Foucauldian discourse analysis. That's almost a bit of sociology. That is about what are the discourses available in a society for people to use. So, in our current society, we have discourses around #MeToo, or gender equality, or romantic love. We all know what we mean by that, so people can use those discourses to do certain things when they communicate. But I'm not going into that just now. Now, cooperative inquiry and focus groups, they aren't really methodologies, they are just ways of collecting data. And both of them involve more than one person at one time. So in cooperative inquiry, you are part of the group as a researcher because you've experienced a similar thing. So together you generate the data. In a focus group, you are not part of the group. So the idea is to throw the questions in the group, close the door and run. No, it's but you have to try and be not part of the group. You can steer it a little bit if it looks like people are not contributing or that they're going off track, but you are not part of the data generating process. Get people to talk with each other. Then there's thematic analysis, which I've put last because it's not a methodology, it's a method. So a methodology is like a package holiday. It tells you where to go, it tells you what to do, with whom to go there. You're all on the same plane and you're all on the same mode of transport. Everything is included. So a methodology gives you all the tools, gives you the philosophical framework for how to analyze your data. Thematic analysis is theory independent. You can use it with any sort of theoretical approach that you want. It's a tool. It's a very systematic and rigorous tool to decode data and to develop themes across a data set. And you can use that in a purely descriptive way, or you can use it in a more interpretative way, but you have to make that decision. You can see it used as small q sometimes. It's never called that, but how to identify small q thematic analysis is, it tends to be driven by a hypothesis, so it tends to be top down, and it tends to be used as a way to, as a precursor to quantitative research. That's not the kind of thematic analysis I want you to do. I want you to do, if you're doing thematic analysis, big Q. That is qualitative research proper, bottom up, in an inductive way. There are several stages to it. I've got a really good article for you by Brown and Clark that tells you exactly what to do in each of those 6 stages. But there's one thing I want to point out to you, because even really famous articles still say this wrong. One of the stages, the 3rd stage, it's called generating themes. It's not called searching for themes, because searching for themes implies that the themes are somewhere waiting to be found. That's not true. You as a researcher generate the themes. It's your background, your interpretation that makes you create certain patterns in the data. So bear that in mind. So you probably want to know what makes good research. You'll know what makes good quantitative research. Is it falsifiable? Is it valid? Is it reliable? Etc. But how about qualitative research? There is a checklist, but they don't all apply to all types of research, and they can be used in a flexible way. We look at validity, but it's not the same meaning as validity in quantitative research. Validity here is more about, can I trust the data? And things to look at is, are you sensitive to the context in which you generated the data? Your personal context, and the context in which the participant was being interviewed, the political, social context. How rigorous did you do it? Did you practice interviewing? How rigorously did you do the data analysis? Did you show it to anyone? Did they help you, or make you see how your interpretation might be different to somebody else's? Is it clear to the reader what you did and how? You need to leave what's called an audit trail. At each step of the analysis, we need to see what decisions did you make and why did you make them. And of course, for all research, there needs to be at the end of it some kind of why was this important to do? Why was this important to know? And how can this drive further research? But we will look at these more in depth as we carry on with the thesis project. So what to do next over the next few months? Thinking about what you want to investigate in a more specific way than the way you thought about it up to now. And then read some literature on the subject. Not with the aim to look at what's going to be my hypothesis, because you don't have a hypothesis, but you do need to know a little bit about what's already known. You don't want to investigate the same thing. So maybe your question's already been answered. I doubt it, but you never know. Maybe parts of your question have been answered, it's more likely. Or maybe, and this is most likely, your question already has been attempted, but using quantitative rather than qualitative research. So, based on that, after you've done that, maybe you want to reformulate your question slightly. And then think about who can actually answer my question. Who will be my participants and where I'm going to get them from. Think about what methodology you need to use to get these answers. Is it going to be thematic analysis, or is it going to be another methodology? And can you foresee any ethical issues, and how would you deal with them? So after you've done that, and of course we can have some backwards and forwards communication about that, then you need to write your project outline, so what you intend to do, and write your consent and debrief, and any interview questions if that's what you're going to do. And then you need to submit that to the ethics committee before the end of August. That's really important, because by September everyone is going to submit their projects to the ethics committee, and you want to start as soon as possible. It's much better to be ahead of everyone else. So try and get that done before the end of August. And it doesn't matter if you're not here, we can communicate over email. So then in September, October, when you've got your ethical approval, that's when you do data collection. So you run your interviews. We've got some recorders for you to use. Or if it's focus groups you're doing, then that's what you'll do. If you decide you don't actually need to interview anybody, but you can use material that already exists, then that's fine too. And then before Christmas you need to have transcribed your data. That takes more time than you think. It involves typing out interviews verbatim, exactly what participants said, including if they said like 1,000 times, you've got to actually type that up. Give each interview a number, take all out of the names, so make it anonymous, and then give it to the second coder. The second coder is an undergraduate student. I think he or she will be a second year student. I'll tell you more about that in a second. So then during the Christmas break you need to analyze your data, and all methodologies or methods will involve some kind of coding. And coding, it sounds a bit sort of mysterious, what's that, but it's essentially what it means is giving a label, a higher order, a more abstract label to a passage of text. So this paragraph, it comes from a study I did. My parents never told me you have to go to university, you have to study. I mean, they do really normal jobs. They never went to university. They said you have to do what you want with your life, and I'm really interested in these particular subjects I'm studying. So taking that to a higher level of abstraction would be the first sentence that could reflect the student's own responsibility for going to uni, and the bottom sentence could be about intrinsic motivation. So you just go through the text writing down codes in the margin or using Word to do that. But the exact nature of this coding will depend on the actual methodology that you do. So when you do descriptive analysis, what you do in that case is you code across the whole body of transcripts. You take them all together and you look for codes. I'm saying it myself, you're not looking for codes, you generate codes. When you've done that, you group all the codes together and you form overarching themes at a more of a higher level of abstraction. If you do IPA, then you essentially do a thematic analysis per person, but then some of those themes might, per person, turn into superordinate themes. And then after you've done that for every person, you then go higher and you create a list of master themes that summarize or overarch the themes within each case. So it's one higher level of abstraction compared to descriptive thematic analysis. Grounded theory is a bit more involved. You would start with line by line coding. Line by line means you type the transcript out and you actually literally line by line put a new code in. And then you try to identify what processes you think there are in the data. What's going on here? What are people doing? What is happening? And you ask analytical questions about it. For example, if it's about disclosure of a mental illness, why do people disclose? What are the consequences of disclosure? How is disclosure different from hiding it? What are the precursors of disclosure? So you ask those kinds of analytical questions about it, and then after that you do focused coding. So you use the codes that you've just created to apply them to the data and apply sort of almost like a self-generated theoretical lens to it. And then what you may do is to raise certain codes, elevate them to become categories. So in grounded theory they're called categories, they're not called themes. And then you need to write statements about these categories. They're also called memos. So you describe what this particular category is about. Then you do, if time allows, you do theoretical sampling. So what that means is you generate a particular theory of how all the categories go together, and then you want to try out certain things. You've speculated that, because of this happens. So you go back to some new participants and you ask them certain questions to test certain parts of your own generated theory. That's why it's called grounded theory. And then when you write up, you need to show all the relationships between the categories, and you can do that in a diagram. If you do narrative analysis, then you need to do two things essentially. One is to first of all summarize the narrative of each participant. So what's the beginning, what's the middle, what's the end, what are the key issues that people are mentioning, how are the different parts, the beginning, the middle and the end, how are they actually linked to each other. And then you need to use that to develop a coding frame that you can apply to each case. And then the second part is more interpretative. You need to interpret these narratives, and you need to use probably literature for that. So what kind of story is this? Are there other studies that have investigated parts of this topic? What stories have they found, and or stories that are not even related to your particular subject, but in other areas of psychology? What type of story is this, and can I relate my participant stories to those other areas? Sounds a bit vague, but it makes sense when you actually start doing it. So a second coder, so that will be a second year student who will see your data and who will essentially do the same analysis as you did. That's not so that you have to agree on it. That's not the purpose, because there's no right and wrong about how to what sort of answers to arrive at. But what this will do is it'll highlight your bias, your particular colored glasses that you use to look at the data. That bias is not wrong, not at all, but it's important that you are aware of it. That's why we have a second coder. For example, this comes from the textbook. The researcher said, some years ago, a young man in my undergraduate seminar conducted research on adaptation to disability. He had become paraplegic himself when he was hit by a car while cycling. His 10 in-depth interviews were filled with stories of courage, innovation and hope. But that's not how the student wrote it up. His analysis of them was a narrative of grief, anger and loss. When I noted that this analysis did not reflect his collected material, I realized how his own feelings of being disabled, colored his perception of other people's disabilities. So the student's own frame of reference influenced what he saw in the data. So a second coder will help you illuminate that process. So moving into 2020, when Aberdeen will be covered in snow, I hope, so it's quite exciting. You need to write an introduction. So what's already known about the topic? The introduction is meant to be quite brief, a lot briefer than it would be for a quantitative thesis. Write your method section as well. How did you do your study? I've got a few example theses that you can have a look at. Make sure you send me your introduction, your methods and your results or feedback. And then we can talk about your discussion, but I can't actually read it. So, when people ask you, you're doing qualitative, how is that different? You can explain to them that you're doing something that's inductive and not deductive. You're not testing hypotheses. You have a short introduction and your results section will be massive. You don't have to do SPSS. Your participant sample will be very small. Maybe it's just 2 or 3 people. as opposed to trying to recruit 100. So we're not generalizing, we are trying to find out about our particular tribe. And it's also different in the sense that in the appendix you need to provide an audit trail. So you need to show all the different steps of your analysis and provide screenshots or photographs of your notes that you took. So that's how it's different. So I'm looking forward to meeting with you, and please bring your question. If you've got any questions after watching this, bring it along and we can talk about it. We can meet throughout the summer if you want, and during term time as much as you like. So don't worry about it, there will be plenty of support. So I will see you in May.